Welcome to Carnegie Politica Podcast. My name is Alex Gabuev. I'm director of Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Today, we're going to talk about Russia's energy policy. As Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is approaching its third anniversary, and everybody is anticipating the presidency of Donald Trump, there is a load of hope that the negotiations that the new team in the White House is about to bring will be focused on cessation of hostility. While trying to lay groundwork for diplomacy, Team Trump is talking a lot about leverage. And one source of leverage over Russia is its perceived economic weakness coming from the backbone of the Russia's war machine, its energy sector. Today, I'm very thrilled to be joined by two of the leading experts on the Russian oil and gas sector. Tatiana Mitrova, who is a research fellow at the Center for Global Energy at Columbia University in New York. Welcome, Tatiana.
Thank you.
And Sergey Vakulenko, my colleague at Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center in Berlin, who is a senior fellow and our lead expert on all energy issues. Welcome, Sergey.
Hi, Sasha.
Tatiana and Sergey, you both have decades, like probably over 50 years of experience in Russian oil and gas. If we combine your expertise, you work both in multinationals and in major Russian companies, were on boards or in senior management roles. So there is plenty to talk about. But let me start with you, Tatiana, and try to take a look back at the 3 years behind us. As Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, there were a lot of efforts to stop the war, and the sanctions program was one of the major one of effort from Biden administration and European leaders. And predictably, the energy sector was at the core of that. So if we are trying to look back in broad brushstrokes, what are the key changes to the Russian energy sector over the last 3 years? And what is the most significant?
I'll try to summarize. There were lots of sanctions imposed, but the major outcome is, to my understanding, that Russian energy sector has moved into survival mode instead of development. There is obviously declining profitability, though Russian budget is still receiving plenty of oil and gas revenues, but this former engine of Russia's economic growth is obviously losing its role. European market, the most attractive both for oil and gas, is lost. Reputation of Russia as reliable energy supplier is ruined. There is this pivot to the east, which Russian leadership was promising for quite a long time. Now, finally, it is taking place, so not in a way that Russia was intending initially, but we can see this growing dependence on China, first of all. And another very interesting development is that, amazingly, this militarizing economy, it significantly drove a domestic energy demand growth. And more energy is consumed domestically. There is this growing reliance on domestic consumers to offset declining export revenues, which is leading to rising domestic energy prices. Another interesting dimension, also domestically, there is increased pressure on the domestic energy infrastructure, particularly in heat and power generation. And actually last year saw massive blackouts and energy deficits inside Russia. So to sum up, there was no catastrophe. Yeah, Russian energy sector is still pretty resilient. But the first signs of this decline and stagnation, they are becoming obvious. Please keep in mind, the sanctions are never about immediate punishment. They are about removing the future development. And I think this is happening.
There have been plenty of sanctions. There are like double digits in number of sanction packages. In the EU, there are multiple sanctions on part of the U.S. administration. If you try to find the most impactful and successful sanctions, what were the measures that you deem as the most efficient currently and then over the medium and long term that you discussed?
Alexander, the tricky thing is that it is not about the sanctions themselves. It's all about their enforcement. So the sanctions which were strictly enforced, they were successful in a way. Uh, the other, which could have sounded very impressive, actually had nearly zero result. Depending on the criteria, what you assume to be efficient sanction. If it is about reducing profitability, reducing revenues of the Russian war machine, then I would say EU oil and oil product embargo, which removed possibility to access the most luxury market. Yeah, it has resulted probably in the largest reduction of the Russian budget revenues. If we are talking, if we take as a criterion the possibilities for the future development, for the growth, then I would say LNG, yeah, Arctic LNG 2 in particular, with very strict enforcement. US authorities basically hunting over each and every LNG tanker serving this project. These sanctions have resulted, they've basically killed so far the prospects for the Russian LNG industry development. That's my take. I would be very interested to hear what Sergey thinks about it.
Sergey, I pass the baton to you, but I would also ask you to comment on the most recent package by the administration leaving the White House and going through the door has passed one of the most comprehensive sanctions legislation. What's important there and how biting do you think it will be for the Russian energy sector going forward?
Indeed, it's a very unusual part and short, I must say. That's not a piece of legislation, an administration that has only days, not even weeks left in the White House would adopt. I think there's a number of reasons for Biden administration to do so. One of them is a commitment device. If Trump's administration would suddenly decide to become too cozy to Putin, this set of sanctions would be rather difficult for them to unwind. They would need Congress approval for that. There was a special regulation of that in CATSA. Of course, this Congress would most likely be much more cooperative with Trump than the one during the first Trump administration, but still, there would be some resistance if Trump would like to cancel the sanctions. Talking about leverage, this is an extremely strong piece of leverage, a strong trump card, sorry for the pun, that was given to the incoming president. And also, I would think that's something that Biden administration always wanted to do, but was too careful to do. In a scare that it would rock the boat too much, in a scare that it would wreak havoc to the global energy markets and so on. Well, if this happens, it wouldn't be their problem anymore. It would be Trump's problem to solve. Indeed, the sanctions are unprecedented. Some tankers were sanctioned before, but not nearly on this scale. What this sanctions package is obviously aiming to do is to remove a part of Russian supply of the world markets. The two Russian companies that were sanctioned, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas, produce between them 2.5 million barrels a day. That's what Kuwait produces. That's more than Norway produces. These two companies combined would be world ninth largest producer. They export roughly half of that production. Again, this would be world ninth largest exporter, 1.5 million barrels a day. Quite substantial. And then the second barrel of this hunting gun, if you wish, is to make sure that once these volumes are reduced, Russia wouldn't benefit from a possible price rise that it would create. So the sanctioning of a substantial chunk of the fleet that was carrying Russian oil in defiance of the price cap mechanism is grounded, at least hopes are that it's grounded, and it was the fleet that was carrying 30% of Russian exports in 2024. So the hopes are that this fleet grounding would beat Russia back into compliance with the price cap mechanism. This administration sanctioned 20% of Aframax tankers. That's a mid-sized workhorse of the global tanker fleet, like the Airbus 320 equivalent in the tanker world. Not the small planes, not super jumpers. Super jumpers would be LCCs, but the workhorses. So, but that's very interesting. How is it going to work? What would be the compliance? What would be the reaction of the three main buyers of Russian crude? Whether the administration would be brave enough and capable enough to make the buyers and other counterparties to work. So that's the outcome of it is to be seen. Returning to the earlier questions about the effectiveness of the sanctions, indeed, the EU embargo, not the price cap, embargo, the inability to supply oil to Europe, to traditional markets, did indeed, for a while, substantially decrease the amount of money the Russian oil industry was bringing home. And when it comes indeed to LNG, Novatek made very impressive effort to build its LNG plant amidst the sanctions regime, but it managed to acquire some LNG tankers, but under sanctions, there were no buyers for these LNG to come. And considering the LNG wave that is coming to the market in the next years, this LNG market would become extremely competitive. That's probably partially of the reason why the US authorities, and US is going to be the main seller of LNG in the years to come, wanted to reduce the supply, but it will be increasingly more difficult for new players to enter the market after this wall of LNG supply, US LNG supply, comes into the market.
Tempted to go into so many different directions, just like all of these shadow fleet tankers that are trying to evade the U.S. surveillance. But before I do that, I will remind our listeners to subscribe to this podcast, like this video, leave some comments to discuss. And I promise that in return, we will leave a lot of material for you in the show notes. Sergey, you've recently written for Carnegie a very interesting piece analyzing the composition of the shadow fleet. And I learned a lot that a lot of the ships are not so old as I assumed, and that many of the ships are not only engaged in carrying Russian oil or Iranian oil, but these are very normal ships that carry just maybe 10% of oil below the price cap. So it's just a very different composition. And right now, it seems that so many of the ships have been sanctioned, so they have nowhere else to go as to really become this part of the shadow fleet. So what do you think the Kremlin counter moves can be to the most recent sanction package? Like, how can you imagine the industry and the Russian authorities adapt? Because time and again, we've seen that with every bullet, there is a counter move by the Kremlin to adapt and find new sources of revenues.
I would think that for starters, they would try to steal a page from Iranian book. Most of Iranian crude, more than half of it in 2024, has been lifted by tankers that's been sanctioned since 2012. Most of these tankers take the crude from Iran to Singapore, east of port limits, ship-to-ship transfer area, as it's called. Then it's transferred, and there's a lot of tankers that pick the crude there and deliver it to China. If you look at China customs data, it shows that the origin of this crude is Malaysia, Johor state, which is just next to Singapore. That's that example of Malaysia exporting more oil than it actually produces from the ground. Most likely, Russia will try to play a trick like this as well. But at least it shows that, contrary to common belief, sanctions do not necessarily mean an instant commercial death of a tanker. Iranian tankers have been sailing around for more than a decade, despite being in the sanctions regime. Of course, there will be difficulties. There will be ports not particularly willing to deal with these tankers. It's a much shorter haul from Iran to Singapore than from Russia to one of these transshipping, transloading points. But most likely, that's a kind of a trick that Russia would try to engage. Another interesting element is the scale of the sanctions. As I mentioned before, 20% of the fleet, of sub-fleet, of Aframaxes, is in the sanction category now. Certain projects might run into substantial problems trying to source ships for their use. So it does create a shortage. If this is a situation, there may be many actors willing or desperate to break the sanctions. And then there's a safety in the numbers. It's quite easy for the US administration to punish single violators of the sanctions. If the violations start to appear en masse, it's much more difficult to do so. And then it's indeed the question, what would be the appetite for the administration to enforce the sanctions? Most likely, it would be a tool for fine-tuning how biting the sanctions would be. If Trump administration would like to reduce the pressure on Russia, the enforcement dial would be wound back. If the sanctions would be tightened, no new regulation would need to be adopted, just tighten the enforcement dial. But as I said, the sanctions are unprecedented, so it's a very interesting subject to observe, and probably would see and realize the full effects only 6 months from now. There would be a lot of volatility, but to be able to analyze what's going on and what was going on, more or less scientifically data-driven, we probably need a few months.
Tatiana, let's try to talk a little bit about the future. As we've discussed, Trump is trying to build leverage. There is a scenario where whatever the outcome of the negotiation will be, it will be achieved rather soonish. There is, however, a different scenario where Trump will try to build more leverage because the direction of talks is not going according to his preferences. So what are the other tools in the toolkit of pressure against the Russian oil and gas sector that are available to Trump's team, other than tightening the enforcement? Is there any other measure that hasn't been taken yet that can be taken eventually?
First of all, I just want to stress once again that enforcement is the key here, because Biden's administration has already created quite good leverage for Trump with the recent sanctions. Yeah, and if enforced properly, they can be rather painful. But on top of that, of course, Trump can sanction the other tankers from the shadow fleet. There are still plenty of them left. He can sanction other Russian majors. Just to remind everyone, Rosneft is not under sanctions. Gazprom is not under sanctions. So there are plenty of opportunities to increase pressure. Then I think on the gas side, there is quite an opportunity with sanctioning the other LNG producers. So the January 10th package sanctioned 2 small LNG plants, but the largest operational plants are not touched yet. I'm talking about Yamal LNG and Sakhalin. And that could be also on the table, especially given the interest of Trump to promote US LNG globally. And these are all measures targeted on Russia. But I'm absolutely convinced that the most important measure which wasn't implemented by Biden's administration and which Trump can actually introduce, these are secondary sanctions. These are specifically sanctions over the ports of the third countries. The recent package actually made the first move in this direction. Shandong United Energy is on the list. Yeah, it is a oil terminal in China, and that was quite an important message to all Chinese and Indian ports. Yeah, because getting on the list is the last thing you want for your port facility. So that would made the off-takers of Russian oil much, much more cautious. And Biden was limited by his relationship with China, with India, but Trump is much more of a hardliner. So he can go into these secondary sanctions stuff, and that would really make a difference, I believe.
Sergey, there is another point of leverage that people are discussing. It's this drill baby drill mood among many Trumpers. The idea that all the U.S. can massively increase oil production, it can probably reach a deal with the Saudi Arabia and really flood the market with cheap barrels of oil while removing the Russian crude from the market entirely, and thus creating leverage for the potential talks over Ukraine. I saw that you've written a piece in the Financial Times. Can you walk me through your logic why you think that's not very feasible?
It's an interesting one. There is Treasury Secretary nominee Bessent's plan called 333, which sets goals for budget deficit to be below 3%, to get steady GDP growth of 3%, and get 3 million barrels a day increase in US oil production. Well, the last three is what matters for us here. Well, if you look a bit closer at the three, it's not 3 million barrels per day, which are pretty much impossible to achieve. It's 3 million barrels per day, not of oil, but oil equivalent. Oil is only 800,000 barrels of that, roughly a quarter. And then it's not such an impressive number. That's pretty much what's already been in there in the forecast by Energy Information Agency. However, and the rest is gas and natural gas liquids, and this gas will be needed to supply these newly built LNG plants. But then if you look at this 800,000 barrels per day production increase in the US, there's a condition for that. This would only happen if oil prices would be $70 a barrel or higher. At $60 a barrel, this production would stay flat. At $50 a barrel, it would go down. And then there is a conundrum or a dilemma for Secretary Bessent and for Trump and for others. On one hand, there is a goal of combating cost of living crisis, combating inflation. So for that, Trump administration would like to see oil prices lower, much lower, $50 a barrel. We should also bite Russia. But at $50 a barrel, you cannot have US oil production growing. So it's either or. There are certain things they might try to do. They say we would take out all the burdensome Biden era red tape, administration costs, and well, there is not so much of all that burdensome administration load that Biden administration introduced. They were talking a lot of green, but they weren't acting upon it. So there's not much to unwind or take out by Trump's administration. They could do certain things, but they would lower US cost production, US cost of production by $2, maybe $5 a barrel, but not 10. So all these levels, 50 decline, 60 stable, 70 growth, 80 substantial growth, well, you could shift it down by 5, but not much more of that. So, and if there's a goal to reduce budget deficit, there is not that many subsidies or tax breaks you could provide to the US corporations to increase US oil production. So that's a really tough nut to crack, and I'm not sure Trump administration will succeed in that. Whether they would get Saudis and Emiratis assistance in crowding Russian oil out of the market is another good question, because it's not really in the interest of Saudis and Emiratis to see an increase in the US production. It's not really an interest in Saudis or Emiratis to see a success of price cut regime, to see the US being able to beat a major oil producer into submission. If it happens, if the US succeeds, if they force Russia into price cap mechanism for the Persian Gulf nations, there's always a fear that NOPIC Act, no OPEC, the one that would punish OPEC countries for participating in a cartel, would be baked on the president's writing desk and might be signed into the law. And that's the last thing they want. So that's also another big question if Trump would succeed in that.
Talking about the reaction of the broader global oil markets and various other players, Tatiana, definitely war against Ukraine and 3 years of Western sanctions campaign against one of the largest producers of oil, pipeline gas, and LNG and coal is definitely felt and is having ramifications. For example, a lot of people have suggested that because of the sanctions that limit access of Russian producers to US dollars and the fact that a lot of Russian companies, including Rosneft, Gazprom, who used to stay away from trading their resources in RMB, the Chinese currency, now a lot of them have switched their payments, at least technically, to RMB. That will fuel the rise of petro yuan instead of petrodollar and actually increase Chinese clout in the global energy market. So if we look at this second order and third order effects for the way the global markets operate, what is the most important dynamics in your view?
Okay, there are several consequences, and the first one, I believe, is amazing stress resilience of the global energy markets, which we all saw during the last few years. Despite these sanctions, despite a massive reduction of gas supplies to Europe, the crisis wasn't as profound as many analysts were expecting it to be. Nevertheless, the idea, the considerations of energy security came back into the first place in the agenda of most of the policymakers around the world. You remember with this energy trilemma, during the last decade, I believe the main focus was on decarbonization, on environmental friendliness. Now it's much more about energy security, localization, reducing import dependency, and I believe that this sentiment will only increase in the future with more conflicts around the world and more confrontation between the big powers. Another important consequence was the obvious win of LNG versus pipeline gas. There was such a discussion like a decade ago whether pipeline gas can be more attractive than LNG in certain circumstances. Now, I believe this discussion is over. If you can import LNG, you would prefer to have LNG because it allows you to diversify your supply risks. Yeah. So these things, I believe, they are important for the whole world, for policymakers everywhere. Then, of course, as you've mentioned, there is this growing fragmentation of the energy markets with this shadow fleet becoming more active with a whole network of different intermediaries and gray payment schemes and everything evolving. There is less transparency, obviously. But I would say it's like a parallel market operating in a shadow. There is obviously growing de-dollarization because most of these transactions, they are not in dollars. These are local currencies like RMB or like rupees. But at the same time, I would say it is still a smaller fraction of the global market. There are nevertheless very impressive plans announced by BRICS to create like its own payment system in competition with the dollar system. I think it might take a long time. It's not an easy road, and I'm pretty skeptical whether it would be successful or not. But what could evolve out of this, and especially if more ports would get sanctioned on the consumer side, is just imagine what will happen now with the Shandong oil terminal. They now can receive only sanctioned tankers. Anyway, they are under sanctions. They have nothing to lose. Yeah, so there could be a specialized infrastructure devoted for these sanctioned deliveries with its own special payment system. Yeah, so part of the market like falls apart and starts to live its own life. And we have no idea what happens there, what are the prices, what are the volumes. It goes completely into the shadow, which is obviously not good for the transparency and liquidity of the global market. But I think this trend will remain there in the future, and potentially BRICS at least will try to increase it.
Let's finally go back to Russia. As Tatiana has mentioned, and I fully agree, the global energy markets have demonstrated remarkable resilience. But so has the Russian energy sector, although the war itself and the sanctions campaign was a major shock to the system. So, Sergey, looking ahead and trying to look around the corner, how would you assess the future of the Russian energy sector in terms of production costs, resource base, and potential markets for the Russian hydrocarbons going forward?
Well, let's start with the resource base and production cost, and there's a subject of my upcoming paper. Russia is in a peculiar situation. On one hand, it sits on a huge production base, but a rather mature production base. There are untapped resources in Russia, lots of them. They could easily deliver production growth, but they are either in remote areas, which require specialized technology that Russia doesn't have, or it's a special kind of resource, tight oil and so on, that also requires quite large upfront outlay of the capital. And capital in Russia at the moment is quite expensive. The country prefers to spend on military, not on oil field hardware. So the companies don't do that. They mothballed all the projects they had, either that they were starting or that they had on the drawing board, with one exception. The exception is Vostok Oil, but there's a strong belief that Vostok Oil by Rosneft is a smoke and mirrors kind of a project that's just waiting for a nice excuse to be cancelled and is staying alive mostly for PR reasons, but it will be to be seen. And the rest of the companies concentrate on what they already have. They're exploiting their legacy. That legacy is quite substantial. On the other hand, and it just happens everywhere in the world with mature resources, you can't really deliver growth on them. To deliver production growth from the new resources, you would indeed be looking for a price like $40 a barrel or something like that before tax, before fiscal split. This is, by the way, the tax regime that US producers enjoy. If this new Russian resources would be in the US tax climate, capital cost climate, and like, they would thrive. But they're not there, they're in Russia. Their older production base can easily not necessarily maintain production, but arrest the decline at a cost of something like $17, $20 a barrel. That would cover capital charge from drilling wells, operating costs, and delivering the oil to the seaports and the cost of capital. $20 a barrel. So it would cost Russia something like $40 a barrel to maintain the plateau or have a small growth, and $20 a barrel to maintain a very slow decline, like 2-3% per annum. So Russia is most likely going into that because Russian oil companies would like to see the growth, and they try to placate the government to give them tax breaks. But if you look at the government finances, the cost of capital, the implied discount rate of the Ministry of Finance is such that it's quite willing to forego additional production 3, 4, 5 years from now uh, at the benefit of having more money available in the coming years. So that's the situation. The government keeps squeezing the oil sector, not necessarily dry, not as bad as the Soviet government was doing in the late 80s, but it doesn't leave much to the oil companies for the development of the new production. However, the existing production base sits quite far to the left of the global oil cost curve and would be sufficient to maintain not stable oil production, but very slowly declining one. And Russia actually has almost all the technologies it needs to do that in country. Some of that has been brought in initially by the international oilfield services. Some of those oilfield services companies have left. Some of them are still in the country, like SLB. SLB is under immense pressure to leave Russia, but the engineers that used to work for Baker Hughes, for example, Halliburton, Baker Hughes and Halliburton left. The engineers stayed. The equipment that those engineers used stayed as well. Most likely that's something that would happen to SLB, a buyback by Russian management and so on. When it comes to drilling rigs, they are available from China, hydrofracking fleets and so on. So everything that's needed for traditional or tight traditional oil production is available for Russian oil producers. They're going to use it. And with that in mind, they would probably not maintain the production, but maintain a slow decline at a cost low enough that would make Russian government able to keep the tax rates roughly at what they are at the moment. Then, of course, if there are embargoes, if there's something that can cut heavily into the price that Russia gets for the oil it sells, this equation might change. But in the absence of that, in the absence of price cap mechanisms, in the absence of a mechanism of revenue for Russian oil going into escrow account and something like that, I actually see Russian oil production will rather stable and very slowly declining.
So my summary of this conversation is A, there is no silver bullet that the Trump team can really use to immediately squeeze the Kremlin into submission and a peace deal in Ukraine that's acceptable to Ukrainians and to the West, at least in terms of energy leverage. To the remarkable adaptability of the global markets and of the Russian energy sector. But here, implementation of the sanctions is much more crucial than the sanctions themselves necessarily. And methodical, well-organized, disciplined implementation can deliver blows to the Russian energy sector beyond what we are seeing now. And finally, the Russian energy field is resilient, but it's also in a state of manageable decline because of the decisions that have been taken by the Kremlin a couple of years ago. And absent something major, a major geopolitical earthquake that will reset the whole situation, it's likely to stay there. I'm very grateful for your time, Tatiana Mitrova from Columbia University and Sergey Vakulenko from Carnegie Endowment for National Peace. We should have you back at some point. And I remind all of our listeners to put likes under this video, comments, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Have a safe start in 2025. Thanks.